You're listening to
DNA ID.
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking.
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
and
Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1996. Cheryl Houchins was a wreck. It was Saturday, September 21st, and her 15-year-old daughter, Danielle, was missing. Danni, as she was known, had left her parents' house at 100 North Davis Street in Belgrade, Montana, around 11:30 a.m., saying she was headed to the West Cameron Bridge recreational area. This was a public area about 3 miles southwest of Belgrade, and it featured trails, fields, woods, and fishing access to the Gallatin River. Cheryl, who was having family friends to visit that afternoon for the annual Belgrade Fall Festival, wanted Danni home by 2. She gave the 15-year-old her own watch to wear so she could keep an eye on the time. So when Danni wasn't home by 2, and then 2:30, and then 2:45, Cheryl started to become really concerned. Danni was not the kind of kid who ignored curfews or disobeyed her parents. Plus, she wanted to see the visiting friends. It was totally out of character for Danni to just not show up long past when she was supposed to. Cheryl and her friend Kathy Schrupp drove to the Cameron Bridge fishing access area where she knew Danni liked to go. As soon as they pulled into the small parking lot, Cheryl saw the family's white pickup truck parked where it would logically be if Danni had driven to the area and parked to go on a hike. But the doors of the truck were unlocked. This was not like Danni, because inside the truck in plain view were some items of value, like Danni's father Rex's computer and some CDs of Danni's. The Houchinses had taught their daughter, a new driver, always to lock the car when she parked it in a public place. Cheryl and her friends started down the path that Danni would have taken toward the river, and almost immediately, Cheryl saw something that made her heart stop. Right there in the middle of the path, 6 feet from the truck, were Danni's car keys and water bottle. As a mother, Cheryl recognized these things immediately. Danni's keychain was decorated with tons of different dangly items on it. It was totally unique to her. Seeing it lying there on the path was surprising and then devastating. Cheryl later told the police, "I immediately felt a knot. It wasn't normal." She started screaming, "Danni, Danni," and running around frantically. She checked the bathrooms, but there was no sign of her daughter. At this point, Cheryl asked her friend Kathy to go home and get her husband Rex. She continued to search on her own until Kathy returned, saying Rex was staying home with the younger kids. No doubt Rex thought Cheryl was overreacting and Danni would show up. Upon her return, Kathy brought Cheryl a jacket because it was cooling off, and they continued to walk the paths looking and calling for Danni. After searching the area in vain for nearly 2 hours, Cheryl decided it was time to go for help. Using a pen she had in her car, she scrawled a note and left it on the pickup truck's windshield. It said, "Danni, we came to look for you. We went for help. We have the keys. Stay here." At 5:13 p.m., a very upset Cheryl called the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. Rex set out for the recreation area, and Cheryl awaited the police. Deputy Timmer was dispatched to the Houchins' home. There, Cheryl made a report about Danni being missing. She relayed that Danni had a leg brace on her left knee because of a recent injury she sustained while dancing with friends at a school dance a couple weeks earlier. She was mobile, but couldn't do really strenuous things like swim rivers or climb trees or fences. Her absence was just inexplicable, and her car keys and water bottle being discarded along the trail, confounding. Meanwhile, at 5:29 p.m., Deputies Johnson and Keith Farquhar responded to the Cameron Bridge recreational area and met Rex there. When they arrived, they noted Danni's white Chevy pickup truck right where her mother said it would be, as well as 4 vehicles parked near it in the parking lot. They got out and searched the area but saw nothing out of the ordinary. A family they came across had seen and heard nothing suspicious or unusual. At around 6 p.m., the deputies decided to summon search and rescue to initiate a ground search, which started at 6:40. Chris Kent of the search and rescue team responded to the scene, observed Danni's truck, and started at the roadway, conducting a grid search of the area from the road through the parking lot and back to the truck. By then, it was getting dark. Even though this was a seasoned search and rescue outfit, the team decided that thanks to the swamp in the area, the large river, beaver holes, traps, and thick brush, it was too dangerous for them to proceed in the darkness. Inexplicably, at 8:20 p.m., they called off the search for the missing teen for the night, and the deputies left to regroup at the sheriff's office and plan their orchestrated search for the next day. While the recreation area was being searched by her husband and the deputies, Danni's mom Cheryl went into town to start checking places Danni frequented and people Danni knew. She went to local Staples Perkins and the Leaf and Bean, but came up empty. It wasn't logical that Danni could have gone anywhere without her truck, but her parents were desperate and looking anywhere they could think of. But despite search and rescue calling off the search for the night, after darkness fell, a pair of local brothers, Kelly and Mike B., went out looking for Danni. What happened was a 12-year-old boy named Levi B. was one of Danni's younger sister Stephanie's closest friends. His family lived near the recreation area. It was the Fall Equinox Festival in Belgrade that day. Stephanie was at a park with her best friend when her dad came by and told her they couldn't find Danni. So Stephanie's friend's mom started driving the girls all over Belgrade, asking if anyone had seen her sister. They stopped at the Belgrade High School girls' basketball game and there ran into her best male friend, Levi. Hearing of Danni's being missing, Levi called his dad, Kelly, from a payphone at Belgrade High School. He told his dad, Danielle Houchins has gone missing, and they're putting together a search party down at the river. Levi begged Kelly to go help look. Kelly and his brother Mike had grown up in the area and were intimately familiar with the recreation area. Kelly called over to the Houchins house and spoke with Cheryl, whom he did not know except in passing. Cheryl said yes, Danni's truck was at the fishing access site and her water bottle and keys were found lying on the trail. They were desperate with worry and they could use any help they could get. So Kelly drove out to the recreation area, and as he parked, he overheard the deputies say they were calling it for the night and planned to return in the morning with waiters. So he grabbed his flashlight and went out into the twilight. But as he started searching the trailhead Cheryl had told him Danni's keys and water bottle were on, his batteries died. He was alone and it was now dark. So he got back into his truck and drove to his brother's house nearby, and Mike agreed to help. They bought some batteries for their flashlights at the IGA and headed to the now pitch-dark recreation area together. They parked around 9 p.m. right next to Danni's truck, still sitting there. Beaming his flashlight into the window, Kelly noticed that the ashtray was overflowing with Cambridge brand cigarette butts. The two men started walking down the trail leading to the fishing access area. 100 feet down the trail, they found another Cambridge cigarette butt lying in the dirt. They followed the trail, shining their flashlights along the fence line, looking into the surrounding shrubs. Eventually, the trail intersected with a little creek, and there they noticed that a cattail had clearly been broken and there was an indentation in the mud. A quote from the report, quote, Kelly said they became suspicious of this location as all other cattails were still intact. According to Kelly and Mike, it appeared as though someone had walked through the area. This area was marshy, and they felt the search and rescue team had not looked there yet, end quote. Jumping over the little creek, Mike's flashlight beam caught something in the marsh about 15 feet away. It was a murky gray form in the muddy marsh and the back of a blonde head. They got just close enough to confirm that this was not a dead deer. It was time to turn back and head to a phone. Kelly marked the location by taking off his jacket and sticking it onto a stick they stuck along the fence line. The two men, who knew that they had just found the missing teenager Danni Houchins, walked back to their truck in silence. As they drove out of the fishing access site parking lot, they stopped as another vehicle was entering. In this truck were Rex Houchins and a male friend. Kelly told the father, "We found your girl, and she is not alive." Rex wanted to see his daughter for himself, so Kelly got out and walked with Rex and his friend while Mike took the truck to go call the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office once more. Rex, Mike, and Rex's friend walked down the trail. They stopped just before the edge of the little creek Kelly and Mike had jumped across earlier. Kelly shone his flashlight into the marsh, illuminating the dim figure among the reeds 50 feet from where the men stood. Then they turned around and returned to the parking lot. Kelly waited for Mike and the deputies, and Rex said, "I have to go tell Cheryl." Rex went to the Houchins' house and found that Cheryl was doing laundry because she couldn't just sit there waiting for news, and even in times of crisis, moms can't afford to let the dirty clothes pile up. Rex said to her, "Danny's gone." She said, "No, they'll find her." And he said, "No, she's gone." They all collapsed, and nothing was ever the same again for the Houchins family. Meanwhile, pursuant to Mike B's phone call, at 9:41 p.m., the original 3 Gallatin County deputies, plus a Deputy Newton, were again dispatched to the fishing access area. Kelly and Mike met them at the parking lot and led them to the area where they found the body. Upon hearing confirmation from the deputies that the body in the marsh appeared to be Danni Houchins, Gallatin County Sheriff's Detective Captain Rob Christie, Detectives Wellsand, France, and Wade, and Coroner Rob Meyer were dispatched to the scene. The body lay prone in a thicketed, marshy area that abutted the hiking trail. Weeds, leaves, and reeds, as well as fallen logs nearby and a large willow overhead, partially obscured Danny's body, which lay in muddy, 8 to 12-inch deep water, punctuated by 2-foot-tall reeds. Her face was submerged in the water with just the back of her head floating on the surface, her blonde hair in a bedraggled ponytail. These are notes from the report written by Detective Sergeant Gary Wellsand. The girl was fully clothed, wearing jeans, a t-shirt, a gray sweatshirt, and a leg brace on her left leg, all things her mother said Danny was wearing when she left the house. She had one sandal on her right foot, but the left one was missing. Further, her bra was pushed up to her neck. Her left arm was extended above her head, and her right arm was down near her right side. A wristwatch was on her left wrist. I noticed that the watch was not in the normal position on the victim's wrist. It was pulled down toward the palm, end quote. Danny's mom's watch had one of those stretchy gold metal bands that expanded to allow the watch to slide over the hand, and the band was found pretty much on Danny's hand rather than her wrist. It looked very much as though this girl, whom everyone knew was Danny, had been dragged by the left arm to where she lay. But that obvious conclusion was not mentioned in any contemporary police reports. After photographs were taken, the body was turned over so coroner's workers could ready the body for transportation. They bagged the hands and wrapped the corpse, and it was removed to the Law and Justice Center at right around midnight. At 2 a.m., the coroner Rob Myers and a chaplain called at the Houchins' home, informing them that they believed Danny had been found. News of the finding of a local girl dead at a popular recreation area swept the small town of Belgrade. Sheriff Bill Slaughter held a hasty press conference to calm fears, saying to the media, "There's no indication of foul play yet." He asked that if anyone saw Danny at the recreation area between 11:30 and 6 p.m., please call in. An autopsy on Danny was performed on the 23rd at the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula by the state medical examiner Dr. Gary Dale. Danny was delivered to the autopsy suite in a yellow disaster pouch, her hair and clothing sodden, muddy water and vegetation sloshing underneath her. Danny was brought in wearing a long-sleeved pullover sweatshirt, a multicolored striped t-shirt, a bra and underwear, button-fly jeans, and a brace on her left leg, as well as a brown sandal on her right foot. The fasteners on the jeans, bra, shoe, and brace were all properly done up. When Dr. Dale removed Danny's outer layer of clothing, he observed that her bra was pushed up above her breasts, and the left side of her underpants was slightly rolled down. The medical examiner's notes say that her clothing, quote, appeared to be properly positioned, except for the bra positioned above the breasts and panties, left lateral lower edge rolled over the top, end quote. In Danny's jeans pocket was $5 given to her by Cheryl when she left the house so she could get some lunch. a tube of Carmex, which I could not have survived without in high school, Danni's driver's license, a half-full pack of cigarettes containing 14 unsmoked wet cigarettes, and a blue disposable Bic lighter tucked into the cellophane. Danni was wearing her contact lenses. Her jewelry also appeared to be intact. She was wearing her hair in a red elastic ponytail holder. She had on a yellow metal beaded chain necklace with a pendant, a string bracelet with 3 beads, and a beaded white metal earring in each earlobe. But it was the watch that caught the attention of the pathologist. This had already been noted by the responding detectives, but the yellow and elastic metal watch band was pulled down around the level of the left thumb joint. Dr. Dale noted that rigor was fully fixed in all extremities and the jaw. He found what he called muddy material in the stomach and upper and lower airways of the 5'5" 130-pound teenager. His report states, quote, abundant material consistent with mud is present within both the tracheal and proximal bronchi. In other words, it was in her trachea and esophagus and all the way down into her stomach. Unfortunately, Dr. Dale did not quantify the amount of mud by weighing it. He wrote, quote, the laryngeal lumen contains abundant material consistent with mud. The gastric contents consist of 30 cc's of relatively clear tan liquid with abundant black-brown sediment. The cause of Danni's death, according to Dr. Dale's report, was drowning. Dr. Dale concluded, quote, until such time as additional information indicates otherwise, the manner of death is undetermined, end quote. Let's be clear that Danni had also sustained the following injuries, also noted in Dr. Dale's report. A punctuate abrasion on the front of her left forearm, a contusion with underlying hemorrhage on the front of her right thigh, a mild contusion with underlying hemorrhage on the center of her left buttock, superficial and punctual abrasions around her eyes and face, lateral right orbit, lower right orbit, lateral left upper orbit, and 3 abrasions were on her right cheek. A contusion near the center of the back of her head, along with a pair of 3/8 of an inch hemorrhages underneath the scalp in that location. But those weren't the only injuries noted on Danni's body. Dr. Dale found a small laceration near Danni's hymen and a punctuate abrasion to the right of her lower vaginal opening. Quote, juxtaposed to the right side of the posterior fourchette is a 3/16 of an inch shallow laceration near the hymenal ring. Note, upon removal of the sodden panties, a small focus of red staining consistent with blood is observed within the crotch region. The labia, vagina, perineum, and anus show no evidence of injury, end quote. Findings. Drowning, with circumstance of decedent's body found submerged, face down in swampy area near public fishing access. Muddy material in stomach, upper and lower airways. Petechiae of lungs. Minor blunt force injuries of face, scalp, and extremities. Recent laceration of vaginal introitus. A tox screen showed Danni had no drugs or alcohol in her system other than caffeine, consistent with a small amount of coffee found in her stomach. Now this is important. 3 foreign brown hairs were collected from Danni's body and another one from her jeans. Of the ones on her person, 2 were collected from her pubic hair combings and 1 directly from her cervix. In addition, a small piece of foreign material was collected from inside Danni's vagina, and a small piece of debris was collected from inside her underwear. Also collected were fingernail scrapings, vegetation from the anterior thorax, debris from Danni's quads and thighs, and vegetation found in her hair. What's missing from this list? The autopsy report makes no mention of a sexual assault kit being done. Let that sink in. Danni's death certificate, dated September 21st, 1996, lists only one word on her cause of death, drowning. Manner of death, undetermined. Specifically, the certificate states, quote, this 15-year-old female died as a result of drowning. Until such time as additional information indicates otherwise, the manner of death is undetermined. Let me set the scene a little here. If you've never been to Montana, it's hard to imagine the sheer amounts of land and forested mountains that make up the spectacular landscape. With geographic features like the Gallatin River and Canyon and Big Sky, the area is an outdoor recreationist's dream, offering fishing, hunting, trapping, skiing, biking, rafting, hiking, rock climbing, all of it. Bozeman is now a trendy tourist town, but back in 1996, it was much smaller, and the small town Belgrade, which abuts it, had only about 3,400 residents. The area is wild, remote, and immense, but in Belgrade, everyone knew each other. The place where Danni perished, the Cameron Bridge fishing access site, was one of 7 such access sites along the 27-mile stretch of the river. This one was scenic and popular with the Belgrade locals for both fishing and other recreational activities. Now let's talk about Danni. Danielle Houchins was born on November 11, 1980, in Alexandria, Minnesota, to parents Rex and Cheryl. The couple was young. Cheryl was only 19 when Danni, as she was called by family and friends, was born. She was followed by sister Stephanie, who was 12 when Danni died, and brother Jake, who was even younger. They had moved to Montana from Minnesota 2 years earlier, in November of 1994. Rex and Cheryl had fallen in love with Big Sky and were both on the ski patrol at the famous downhill resort. The Houchinses were a very outdoorsy family, and Danni assimilated well when she was thrust into the Belgrade public schools in 8th grade. When she died, she was a sophomore at Belgrade High School. She was 5'5" with blonde hair and glasses, which had recently been traded in for contacts. Photos of Danni show her always offering up a big grin. She loved to prank and play tricks and had a great sense of fun, but Danni was also smart, very smart. Her academic achievements were recognized in Who's Who of American high school students for her performance as an honors student. She particularly excelled in math and science, and her ambition was to become a biological engineer or a doctor. Interviews described her as intelligent, independent, well-liked, emotionally stable, even-keeled, introspective, confident, and social, but not yet experienced or sexually active. 10 years after her death, her mother described her as a free-spirited, funny, beautiful, talented, smart girl who was taken way too young. In addition to her academic pursuits, as I indicated, Danni enjoyed hiking, rock climbing, river rafting, swimming, and skiing. Her family said she was strong and athletic, not someone who would go down without a fight. Danni was also in many ways a typical teen. She loved candles and incense, getting coffee and going to movies with her friends, and listening to 90s-era grunge on her CD player. Danni's parents were fairly liberal and allowed her to drink small amounts of alcohol while at home with them, and knew that she smoked marijuana and cigarettes on occasion. Police reports indicate that Danni had a lot of friends, with at least 5 close friends, both male and female, and no known enemies. She had gone steady with a boy named Alex H. for about 4 months, but that relationship had ended in April of 1996. The Houchins family didn't go to church, but Danni often attended events, gatherings, and trips hosted by the Belgrade Student Ministries, in which several of her friends were actively involved. Danni's funeral at Belgrade Alliance Church was attended by 400 people, including 100 of her classmates. Photos of her were on display. 20 flower arrangements adorned the church, and Danni's ski equipment sat under a banner that read, "Heavenly Powder," in gold glitter. The presiding Reverend, Dave Hansen, was Danni's best friend Laura's dad. He told the attendees to place all their questions about Danni's unexplained death into a sack and give it to God. A memorial fund was also set up at Valley Bank of Belgrade to defray the funeral expenses. When it was all over, Danni was buried in Cottage Grove Cemetery in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. Crosses, photos, and mementos soon adorned fence posts and trees at the fishing access site where she had died. Okay, let's go back to the time when Danni was first found at the Cameron Bridge fishing access site. On Sunday morning, the investigators, including Sheriff Slaughter himself and Undersheriff Wilson, returned to the area 3 miles southwest of Belgrade to search it in daylight. They were armed with a metal detector and other items to facilitate a search of the swampy area. They strode to the location at the West Cameron Bridge fishing access. Danni had been found just about 200 yards west of her truck. There was no awareness of crime scene preservation, and everything was trampled over and compromised. They soon found Danni's right sandal in a shrub 20 feet from where her body had lain. They also found a distinct footprint in the mud that the deputies felt sure was from a suspect. These were not casted, although photographs were taken. Again, there is no certainty that this footprint didn't belong to search and rescue, law enforcement, first responders, or civilian searchers. It was a mess. The investigators did collect dirt and gravel samples from the parking lot and a sample of mud from where Danni's missing shoe was found. But they didn't collect the cigarette butt that had been found along the path, and they didn't fingerprint Danni's water bottle. They returned it to her mother. Then there was Danni's truck. It was towed to the sheriff's office facility to be processed. But the deputies were untrained in evidence preservation techniques and went through the vehicle with no gloves on, touching everything. No photos were taken. The CSIs later lifted 24 latent prints from items inside Danni's truck, CDs and other items on the lower dash, a paperback book on the front seat, the driver's door map pouch, glove compartment items, the computer of Rex's, and so on. 8 of the prints were suitable for APHIS entry and searched with negative results. The rest were smudged or unusable. One of the first orders of business was for sheriff's investigators to interview Danni's parents. Cheryl sat down with Detective France on Sunday the 22nd. She told the whole story of how Danni went missing and their search for her. She talked about finding the truck and the water bottle and keys. She said that the only people they saw during their search were some fishermen who said they had not seen a teenage girl with a leg brace. Cheryl gave Detective France the lowdown on why Danni was out at the fishing access site alone. She had left the house upset and wanted to get out on her own to one of her favorite places. On Friday night, the night before, Cheryl and Rex had been out partying at a friend's house. Cheryl had left to go home, but Rex had stayed out. When Cheryl got home, she caught up with Danni, who had been to a street dance with her friends. She got home around 10:45. In the morning, Cheryl woke up at 7 and realized that Rex had not come home at all. And she was panicked that Danni had overslept. She was supposed to go on a paintball outing with her best friend Laura Hansen's church youth group that morning. But when she went into Danni's room, her daughter said that she had a stomachache and decided to stay home. Danni called Laura and told her she had a stomachache and was skipping the paintball outing. They agreed to meet up later at the fall festival, taking place in the park right next to the Houchins' home. Danni was quite upset that Rex had not come home. I think it's possible that Rex drinking too much and staying over at a friend's to avoid a DUI had happened more than once in the past. But on this Saturday, it was his birthday, and Danni had made him a cake, and he was nowhere to be seen. Cheryl started calling around looking for her husband. She was unable to locate him, but at 10:30 he called and said he'd run into some friends and ended up partying all night in Big Sky. Danni saw that her mother was upset and crying, and she was angry with her dad and started crying too. Cheryl and Rex had separated in the past because of Rex's behavior, and this relapse of sorts brought back bad memories of that time. A quote from the police report. Danielle told her mom she did not want to be there when Rex came home because she was afraid of what she would say to him. She told her mom she was going to Cameron Bridge. End quote. This was when Cheryl gave her daughter $5 for lunch and her own watch and told her to be home by 2. The fishing access area was a place that Danni visited often with friends, and it was teeming with hikers and fishermen and other outdoor hobbyists. There was no reason whatsoever for Cheryl to hesitate about letting her go alone. Danni left, and after a while, Rex got home. They chatted about what an ass he was. Then he napped on the couch while their friends popped in and out from the fall festival in the park next door. Then Cheryl noticed that Danni was late. Detective France asked Cheryl about Danni's emotional state. She said her daughter was tough and it took a lot to make her cry. She did note that it was unusual that Danni had been crying that Saturday morning, and, quote, it makes her think that something else was possibly going on. However, she didn't know of any issues that Danni had with any friends or boyfriends or anything. Detective France asked about Danni's knee injury, and Cheryl explained she had partially torn her MCL at a school dance 2 weeks earlier, but after consulting with Dr. Campbell, the local orthopedic surgeon, he recommended a knee brace for 6 weeks rather than surgery. She had been very mobile even when she was on crutches at first. This is a quote from the report. Cheryl stated Danielle was getting around pretty good as of late, and it would not hamper her ability to get up if she fell. Then the detective asked if Danni was an outdoors person and was comfortable navigating the woods alone. Cheryl told him that Danni was very outdoorsy, was very familiar with the fishing access site, and she would not get lost or turned around. Detective France asked about Danni and Rex's relationship. Cheryl said they were close and engaged in a lot of outdoor activities together. No, she'd never noticed anything more than a normal father-daughter relationship between the two. The detective asked if Danni would get upset easily, and Cheryl said no. The detective asked if Danni was upset enough with her father that she would have done something stupid like take her own life. Cheryl said absolutely not. When asked about Danni's morals, she admitted that Danni smoked pot and was honest with her parents about that. And she also said that Danni was not sexually active. Why was this detective asking whether Danni could have fallen and been unable to get up, and whether Danni was upset enough to harm herself? Detective Wade and Detective Sergeant Wellsand sat down to interview Rex on Sunday the 22nd. They talked about how Rex went to party in Big Sky and was unable to get in touch with his wife until 10:30 on Saturday morning. He said Danni and Cheryl were both pretty upset with him about not being home or calling. He had hitched a ride back to Bozeman with a buddy named Randy, who was also a Big Sky ski patroller. When they drove back to Belgrade, they were sitting at the intersection with I-90, and he saw Danni drive by in her truck sometime between 11:30 and 12. She was headed south on Jackrabbit Lane, heading toward the Cameron Bridge fishing access site. When he got home, Cheryl told him that Danni was upset with him and had gone to the recreation area, but would be home around 2. Rex took a nap on the couch. I'm guessing he was pretty hungover, no judgment, and Cheryl woke him up to tell him that Danni was missing. Rex told the detectives the names of some people who had been out at the fishing access area that day, helping him search for Danni. They were friends of his named John D., Brian R., John H., and his wife Rachel. The group had searched until around 9 p.m. and decided to go home. When he got home, Cheryl was being supported by friends, so he and Brian decided to go back out and check the KOA campground and Bozeman Hot Springs areas. On their way back to Belgrade, they decided to stop at Cameron Bridge and at least yell for Danni one more time. When they pulled in, that's when they met Kelly B., who told them they had found Danni's body. Rex said that he felt his daughter was very familiar with the Cameron Bridge fishing access site. She and her friends liked to use the rope swing, and she came out there sometimes to be alone. Detective Sergeant Wellsand asked Rex about his relationship with his daughter. He said they got along well and she was a great kid. They generally had no problems with her. He said he and she enjoyed backpacking and rock climbing together. He said the one issue was that she was smart and courageous, but she was also stubborn and strong-willed, and sometimes they butted heads, and this resulted in screaming matches. He had even whacked her on the head a few months earlier when he lost his temper. He said he knew Danni smoked, and he thought she smoked Cambridge cigarettes because that was his and Cheryl's brand. He mentioned that Danni had a diary and handed it over to the detectives. Investigators gathered the names of people in Danni's life. These were her best friend Linda Hansen, her ex-boyfriend Alex H., her close friends Ryan D., Steve R., Christine D., and Ben E. There were 3 guys named in her diary, Matt D., Avery, and someone named Big Dan. Mind you, I'm not stating that the investigators interviewed all these people. They compiled lists of names and circled the wagons. They did run the license plates of the 4 vehicles that had been parked at the trailhead when the deputies initially arrived at the fishing access site. They were registered to Jenny and Bach S., Scott S., Walter and Peter M., and Donald A. They didn't interview these people either. Deputies made notes in the case file about suspicious interactions and potential persons of interest that should be followed up on. Men like John S., who had been stopped by deputies at the Cameron fishing access area walking around in the dead of night with a candle. He claimed to be holding a vigil for Danni. Another man named Will S. had been stopped near the bridge, acting very suspicious. A few people outside the family were interviewed. For example, on September 23rd, Deputy Farquhar interviewed Randy S., who was part of Rex's alibi. He'd picked Rex up hitchhiking from Big Sky on Highway 191 sometime between 10 and 10:30 on that Saturday morning. When they drove through Belgrade, Randy confirmed that Rex pointed out his daughter Danni driving his truck southbound on Jackrabbit Lane near the Belgrade overpass. But no one asked Randy what time he had dropped Rex off at the fire station, which is where he had left his car. So unfortunately, his statement was not very useful in verifying Rex's story. Another person interviewed was Kelly B. He related to the investigators how he and his brother came to be at the recreation area and find Danni's body. He told them about noticing a Cambridge cigarette butt on the trail that matched the ones in Danni's vehicle. He said it should still be there because he and his brother didn't pick it up. But no one in law enforcement picked it up either. Danni's ex, Alex H., was interviewed. He had slept over at a friend's house on Friday night and was there until about 10 on Saturday morning. From there, he went to work at Pork Chop John's in Bozeman, where he was confirmed to have worked from 10:30 to 8. Some other kids from the high school were also interviewed but had nothing to add. And that was about it in terms of investigating. Detectives France and Farquhar were eager to pursue the case, feeling strongly that Danni's death was highly suspicious. But after the autopsy on September 24th, the sheriff's office announced that Danni had drowned. Sheriff Slaughter told the media, quote, "That's surely what we suspected. The fact that there weren't any cuts or bruises is also worth noting. I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that this may have been an accidental drowning." What? The sheriff and the coroner completely ignored the injuries to Danni's body and the positioning of her clothing and body that pointed to a sexual assault and murder. There was a sense that the powers that be kind of wanted this case to go away. They pushed the accident theory, citing the medical examiner's report of a drowning. Danni's sister Stephanie later told the Montana Free Press that her family's demands that the case be investigated was brushed off with claims that Danni died in an accident. The Houchinses were never told about the evidence of sexual assault or the injuries to the back of Danni's head that pointed to her being held face down in the muddy water. As Stephanie said, quote, "What they portrayed was, well, we don't know, but it really just could have been an accident. You know, she had that knee brace on and she kind of just tripped and fell," end quote. That despite a statement from Danni's orthopedist, Dr. Campbell, to the effect that the brace would not have impeded her from getting up if she had fallen or tripped in the very shallow water. According to investigators who witnessed this, including Keith Farquhar, Sheriff Slaughter said within the confines of his office, "What the F does a doctor know?" He and coroner Rob Myers were tight and seemed determined to back their agenda of portraying Danni's death as a tragic accident rather than a homicide, to the point that they did not reveal to the family the injuries or sexual assault suffered by Danni. This was all the more outrageous given the 4 hairs found at Danni's autopsy. These hairs were determined by the state of Montana Department of Justice forensic scientist Alice Ammon to be inconsistent with Danni's own hair. Ammon noted that all the hairs were short, about an inch long, and believed them to be, quote, naturally shed arm hairs. In other words, they had no root. The year was 1996, and DNA was now the gold standard in investigations. But without a root, these hairs were not a source of nuclear DNA, and were deemed not to be of much use other than to compare to body hairs of suspects. So, hair standards were collected from several people: Cheryl and Rex, Mike and Kelly B., Levi, Laura, Dr. Dale, Rob Meyer, Detective Rob Christie, Deputy Mike Hirsch, and friends and acquaintances of Danni. No match was found, but that did not mean that the hairs did not remain crucially important clues to what had happened to Danni. Those arm hairs came from someone else, someone with inch-long brown hairs on his limbs. But after the hairs failed to match to anyone, they were stored away between glass slides and forgotten. When I was starting to write this case up and found myself incredulous at the ruling that Danni's manner of death was undetermined, I spoke to some insiders about what on earth had happened here, and here's what we think. This region of Montana, the whole state really, sees few to no murders that aren't domestics. The investigators from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office really had very little idea how to go about investigating a homicide in which a girl appeared to have been attacked and killed by a stranger. When they struck out in interviewing people who knew her and her acquaintances, the investigators spun their wheels. Although the detectives in the sheriff's office meant well, and to be clear, felt strongly that Danni's case needed to be worked, they weren't trained or experienced in the best way to go about that. Combine that with the powers that be getting tunnel vision and undermining the investigators by forcing their agenda. Investigators I spoke with believe that Sheriff Slaughter assumed that Danni was a typical promiscuous teenager. After all, her parents admitted that she smoked pot and drank on occasion, and she had had a boyfriend in the past. She probably arranged to meet a boy out at the fishing access site, because otherwise, what would she have been doing there? The two perhaps had a dispute over sexual activity, which is why her clothes were in disarray, and Danni somehow fell and drowned because of her bum leg. Of course, it's completely ridiculous. But some of the original investigators said that Sheriff Slaughter had a big ego and might have been anxious to bury this case, so it would not be a blight on his tenure in office. He didn't want to be the only Gallatin County sheriff with an unsolved murder on his record. A tragic accident needed to be the party line. In September 1997, a year after Danni's death, Sheriff Slaughter maintained the illusion that Danni's case was being worked. The Bozeman Daily Chronicle ran a story in honor of the first anniversary of Danni's mysterious death and asked the sheriff what his agency was doing. Slaughter told the reporter that he had wanted the case to be worked as a homicide, but it was beyond his control, and in the article he managed to push his agenda. Here are some excerpts. Quote, "He was convinced the Belgrade high school student found September 21, 1996, floating in a marsh at the West Cameron Bridge fishing access was a homicide victim. But Gallatin County Coroner Rob Meyer wasn't so sure. There was no visible bruising on Houchins, indicating she'd been held under the 18-inch deep bog friends and family members found her in. There were no visible signs of a struggle. Houchins, Slaughter believed, possessed a hair, a clothing fiber, something that would set the record straight about her death. She didn't. In all seriousness, it's really a mystery," Slaughter said recently. "We've always worked it as a homicide, but the evidence isn't conclusive." Can I interject here? What about the hairs, the injuries to the back of Danni's head and her vagina, the messed up clothing, the inhaled mud? Back to the article. Quote, "Neither Myers nor the state's forensic scientists are willing to now say conclusively Houchins was murdered," end quote. Danni's case stagnated, deliberately put on ice by senior Gallatin County authorities. Her family was not just left without answers. They were gaslighted, told that Danni was an accident victim, and their certainty that she had been deliberately killed by someone completely disregarded. But an undercurrent of dissent with the classification of Danni's case as an accident rose within the sheriff's office. Investigators like Keith Farquhar and Cindy Botek were adamant that Danni had been murdered. This is all from the Montana Free Press. Quote, "Two former sheriff's office officials with direct ties to the case criticized Slaughter's office's initial investigation into the case, saying department leadership and lead investigators at the time were too quick to dismiss the death as an accident or hint at the possibility of suicide. Then Deputy Keith Farquhar was among the first sheriff's deputies to arrive on the scene when Danni was first reported missing, and he was the second officer to return to the scene after two men who volunteered to continue searching after dark discovered her body around 9:30 p.m. Farquhar, now a veterinarian living in Helena, was involved in the investigation for the first few weeks before returning to patrol duty. I never felt like that was being pursued in the manner of somebody killed this girl and we need to find them, Farquhar said. Farquhar said Slaughter appeared too eager to accept the notion that Danni's death was an accident or maybe self-inflicted or that the cause was otherwise impossible to determine. His attitude from everything I saw was, "We just want this over with," Farquhar said. I don't know what his motivation was, but you shouldn't give up on a homicide of a 15-year-old girl. It just seemed wrong to me to say, "Oh, well, it's undetermined." And then for subsequent sheriffs to just not pursue it as well, it was really unsatisfactory to me. Farquhar, who joined the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office as a deputy in 1989, resigned on December 31st, 1996, 3 months after Danni's death. "I have thought about Danni at least every 2 or 3 days for the last 28 years, Farquhar said, end quote. This is from the show 48 Hours, quoting Keith Farquhar. "Common sense says this girl was not an accidental death." Caught in the middle of this controversy was Deputy Keith Farquhar, then a young patrolman. He was assigned to work with detectives on the case. Farquhar spoke with Danni's doctor. Farquhar says, "He said there's nothing about her physical condition that would have prevented that girl from being able to roll over in a few inches of water and mud to breathe if she had just fallen if this was an accident." But when Farquhar tried to report the doctor's opinion to other investigators, Farquhar says, "I was pretty much ridiculed by the sheriff." Peter Van Sant says, "What'd he say?" Keith Farquhar says, "He said, 'What the fuck does a doctor know?' And that statement sticks in my mind to this day." Bill Slaughter, the former sheriff, denies Farquhar's allegations. He says Farquhar was a disgruntled employee and that his department never ignored any evidence. Fed up and disillusioned, just 3 months after Danni's death, Farquhar resigned from the sheriff's office. End quote. All that from 48 Hours. Danni's case was essentially shelved. 2 years after Danni's death in 1998, there was a major scandal that rocked the sheriff's office and raised questions about the investigative work on Danni's case. The lead investigator on her case for the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, a seasoned sex crime detective sergeant from California named Gary Wellsand, was arrested for an absolutely shocking string of crimes. He had sexually assaulted a teenage Belgrade girl and had been caught grooming other potential victims. Wellsand had been significantly involved in investigating Danni's case, and when his work was reviewed in hindsight after his arrest, as one detective wrote, quote, "It was clear that as an interviewer, his questions were much too sexual in nature to be appropriate for 14-year-old kids who were simply possible witnesses," end quote. Wellsand ended up being charged with 6 different crimes, including attempted sexual assault, after it came out that he had a 2-year-long relationship with a 12-year-old girl he had groomed after investigating a case in which she was the victim. As they spent time together, they watched porn that he stole from the police property room together and masturbated as they did so. He tried repeatedly to kiss and touch her. Wellsand claimed he was not a sexual predator and that his behavior had changed dramatically after he sustained a head injury in a car wreck in July 1995. Prior to that, he had an impeccable record as a deputy in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and had served in the Navy and Vietnam. But it turned out his military record was exaggerated, and one of his victims, a girl named Amanda, reported that Wellsand had sexually assaulted her when she was 12 or 13 after plying her with alcohol and pot. She also said that he told her all the details of the Danielle Houchins accidental death investigation, including that Danni had inhaled mud and that because of her leg brace, she couldn't get out of the mud. When all of this came out, Wellsand was prosecuted, but pleaded down and managed to get just 15 days in jail and sex offender treatment, as long as he promised to never work in law enforcement again. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and Prosecutor's Office closed ranks around him and protected him from any real consequences for his heinous actions. In the 2000s, Detective Cindy Botek worked Danni's case. I'm not sure if she did all of this on her own time because the sheriff's office was certainly not interested in reviving it. Botek started as a deputy with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office on September 19, 1996, 2 days before Danni's death. She was convinced that Danni had been murdered and later said Danni's unresolved case weighed on her daily. She became a detective in 2003 and requested the case file and found that it consisted of just one notebook, and she was discouraged from bringing it up. Detective Botek's goal was to petition the medical examiner to review the case and change the manner of Danni's death from undetermined to homicide. That way, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office would be forced to reinvestigate the case as such. So, Detective Botek looked over the file and the names mentioned of men who had connections to the Cameron Bridge fishing access site, who had been seen there, or who were mentioned as odd or suspicious, and she focused on them. She conducted interviews with some of these men and came up with several whom she felt were persons of interest. In February 2004, Detective Botek interviewed a Charles F. Charles was named as someone who frequented the Cameron Bridge fishing access site and had been heard making vague statements alluding to being remorseful over having hurt someone. In his interview, Charles denied having anything to do with Danni's death. Detective Botek collected arm hairs from Charles, which were submitted to the Montana State Crime Lab for comparison to the arm hairs found on Danni's body. On February 11, 2005, trace analyst Alice Ammon concluded that Charles's hair standards were inconsistent with the suspect hairs. Detective Botek moved on to a man named Heath R. His name was in the original case file as someone who lived next to the Cameron Bridge fishing area. He had a tattoo on his right shoulder that he claimed was a tattoo of Danni that he had gotten in order to memorialize her. Detective Botek interviewed him and noted his name as a continuing person of interest. In 2005, Detective Botek got an investigative consulting firm called RMP International in Crestwood, New York, to prepare an equivocal death evaluation report. I'm not sure where she obtained the funding for this report, since the sheriff's office did not back her endeavors. RMP International interviewed Detective Botek and examined the police incident and follow-up reports, crime scene photographs, and the medical examiner's report. Here are some details from RMP's conclusions. Quote, Danielle's toxicology information supports the probability that she may have been at her favorite coffee shop in town before going to the fishing access. She may have had a chance or prearranged meeting with a male acquaintance and then decided to go to the place of occurrence with that person after leaving the coffee shop. It appears that Danielle smoked a last cigarette after arriving in the parking area and walking toward the stream location where she died. The medical examiner's description of her undergarments and the hair recovered in them suggests she consensually engaged in mild sexual contact with her companion shortly after they arrived at the side of the stream. The injuries to her vaginal area indicate Danielle most likely cut short that activity after her companion became too aggressive. At some point, something must have been said to enrage her companion, and he would have suddenly overwhelmed Danielle and forced her face first into the water. The facial injuries she received are consistent with grinding her head into the stream bed. The injuries to her right forearm the front of her right thigh, and her buttocks are also consistent with a stronger person straddling the rear portion of her body while she remained face down in the water and violently struggled to save her life. The contusion and underlying hemorrhage in the back of her head clearly indicate her head was brutally ground into the mud for an extended period of time as she repeatedly gasped for air and continuously ingested the sediment from the stream bed down her airway and into her stomach. Danielle's injuries and the abundant amount of mud found inside her body are totally consistent with forcible drowning by the hand of another. Her death is clearly a homicide, and it is expected that her companion/killer waited until he was certain Danielle was dead before fleeing the scene. Well, there it was in black and white, the unbiased opinion of investigative professionals who reviewed the case from an objective standpoint. The report continued, offering a profile of Danni's killer. He acted alone. He was among Danni's circle of friends and acquaintances. He was a white male, aged 14 to 19. He was in good physical condition. He was likely described as average and was not a deviant who carried a weapon or got into fights or trouble with police, nor was he a star athlete. He likely had few friends who really trusted him, and he was immature, impulsive, and insecure. He might have an explosive temper and was known to be self-centered. He had suppressed hostility toward women and treated women and girls as inferiors. The report noted that given Danni's parents' statements about her strong personality and sense of self, she was unlikely to be easily controlled by this offender, and she likely would have physically and verbally resisted any efforts by him to do so. She was killed because she rejected his advances, threatening him with embarrassment and, in his mind, doing him a wrong. He felt that she deserved what she got. After the crime, he likely was interviewed by investigators and carefully kept tabs on the progress of the investigation, but avoided discussion of it with associates. I'd like to point out here that RMP International's theory about what happened was predicated on their belief that Danni knew the suspect and willingly engaged in mild sexual activity with him. That theory completely disregarded the evidence that Danni was attacked by a stranger, her keys and water bottle discarded on the path, no one having any idea of any males she would have met up with, and her going to Cameron Bridge being a last-minute deviation from her plan for the day. I will say that one thing the original investigators failed to do was collect phone records for the Houchins' home to see if Danni had received any calls or called anyone that morning. By the time modern investigators went to do that, the records no longer existed. The investigators also failed to contact any of the people whose license plates put them at the Cameron Bridge fishing access site that day, and contact most of the males named in Danni's diary. Check to see if any male teens skipped the Saturday church group trip outing Danni had been scheduled to attend, and so on. Detective Botek had an uphill battle to do all those things now, 10 years after Danni's death. One interesting thing Detective Botek did in March 2006 was give people close to Danni some investigative questionnaires, which were provided to me with the case file. Laura Hansen, Danni's best friend, wrote on her questionnaire that Danni's death was a tragic murder and unsolved mystery. She wrote, "I never believed it was anything else but a murder, even when it was suggested that it was suicide. Nothing fits to make it an accident." The timeline from when she went to the fishing access area was supposed to be home, time of death, and the time the body was found, none match up to be anything but a murder. Laura Hansen wrote that she believed she was the only peer of Danni's that was questioned at the time, and that others should have been interviewed. She specifically mentioned classmate Stephen Burkholder, whom she said was the person she suspected most. Rex Houchins also filled out his questionnaire in March 2006. He said he had ruled out any scenarios that involved an accidental death. He wrote, "Danni was a trusting and friendly young lady. I can only believe that someone took advantage of that in the most tragic way possible." Cheryl's questionnaire said that as far as she knew, Danni went to the fishing access site by herself, but someone chased her based on the dropped keys. She knew the keys were something that Danni was really proud of as a new driver, and she never would have dropped them unless she had to. Cheryl said, quote, "The details were told to us she ran into a marshy area, lost her shoe, and fell. She drowned in 6 inches of water," end quote. The pain and agony of Danni's family and her friend Laura are evident in their responses to these questionnaires. They write about the not knowing, the lack of resolution, frustration, and great sadness at being asked to revisit all this. By this time, Rex and Cheryl were divorced, and Cheryl had moved out of state, feeling that it was just too painful to remain in a place that had so many memories of her daughter. In November 2006, Detective Botek collaborated with Lieutenant France, who had been one of the original deputies responding to Danni's crime scene and who agreed that her case was not adequately investigated. They interviewed an Adam V., who had been a Belgrade youth back in 1996. Adam had been tipped to the sheriff's office after he told a friend he couldn't live with the guilt anymore and that Danni was visiting him in spirit. In his interview, he denied any knowledge regarding Danni's death and signed a search form for a collection of head and arm hairs. These hairs were clearly distinct from the suspect hairs, so Adam was back Bernard. Detective Botek also tried to fill in all the holes in the investigation. Many people had never been interviewed. Laura Hansen and Alex H. were the only two of Danni's peers who knew her well to have been questioned. Detective Botek tried to track down males who were mentioned in the case file, including the 3 guys whose names appeared in Danni's diary. Detective Botek gave an interview to the Montana Free Press and said that investigating Danni's death as a homicide never appeared to be a priority for department leadership. People drown all the time, Botek said, and what's in their body? There's water in their lungs, right? That's what you find. What did we find in Danielle? A stomach full of mud. That doesn't happen in a drowning. Who swallows mud? Well, and I might point out, 15-year-old girls don't walk through marshy water with one sandal on and their bras pulled up over their breasts. Back to the Montana Free Press article. Quote, Botek started reinvestigating the case around 2006 after joining the detective unit. She said when she tried to chase new leads in the case, she received pushback from her bosses and was stonewalled by former investigators who had worked on the case. This case always bothered me because I was a couple days on the job when it happened and I'm like, somebody fucking killed her, Botek recalled. Where was the pressure? Where was the pressure to find a murderer? On January 28, 2009, Detective Botek arranged for the submission of several pieces of evidence to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis by analyst Jen Rivas. The goal was to see if there was any item in evidence from which the analyst could derive an autosomal DNA profile of a suspect. The items submitted were Danni's fingernail clippings, cigarette butts from the Chevy truck's ashtray, and Danni's bra and underwear. It took more than a year, but on April 27, 2010, analyst Rivas contacted Detective Botek and informed her she had found one single sperm cell in a stained area on the crotch of Danni's underwear. Rivas requested a consumption letter in order to process the absolutely minute amount of DNA from the stain and the swabs from Danni's fingernail clippings. On November 3, 2010, Ms. Rivas advised that the profile from the fingernail clippings was female and was Danni's own. There were no other contributors. On January 19, 2011, analyst Rivas advised Detective Botek that she was unable to develop a DNA profile from any of the evidence that had been submitted, including the sperm cell in the underwear. I have to assume that this was because in 2010, the Montana State Crime Lab was not equipped to derive a profile from such a small amount of DNA. And that seemed like that. But even though no DNA came from the sperm cell, let's note how significant it was that a sperm cell was found. Danni's parents, friends, and her doctor all reported that Danni was not yet sexually active. Yet, she had been found with injuries to her vaginal area, foreign hair in her pubic hair combings and on her cervix, her underwear and bra all out of place, and now a sperm cell in her underwear. It sure sounded like she had had violent sexual contact with a male sometime immediately preceding her death. Later in 2010, Detective Botek finally made some headway on a suspect whose name she had found in some handwritten detective's notes and the questionnaires filled out by both Cheryl and Laura Hansen. The reference was to the name Steve Burkholder, a new kid in town who was acquainted with Danni and her friends. But everyone who talked about him got his last name wrong. It was not Burkholder, which made it hard to figure out who he really was. Cheryl reported that Steve had shown up at Danni's house right after her family learned that she was missing, which they found very odd because he and Danni were not close. Danni's best friend Laura reported that this Steve guy had shown up at the Hansons' house that Saturday night too, after Danni was found dead. He said he had heard about Danni being missing on his CB radio, which the family found strange. He had had a crush on Danni that was not reciprocated, and after her death, this kid talked about it incessantly, even spreading some rumors that he had gotten Danni pregnant. He had some scratches on his person that he said he had sustained when he got beaten up on the very day of the incident. And then Steve and his mom abruptly moved back to Wisconsin a month after Danni's death. Detective Botek felt that she had found a very good suspect, and she set out to figure out what his real name was. She consulted Belgrade High School resource officer Mike Dixon, but had no luck. Next, she tried the school enrollment records. Detective Botek worked with the Belgrade School's curriculum secretary, Trish Womack, and found the name Stephen Brocklacker in the files. He had started school at Belgrade High School in August 1996 and withdrawn on October 11, 1996, because he and his mother moved back to Wisconsin. Brocklacker had a record that indicated he was violent and impulsive. In one incident leading to an arrest, he threatened his mother during an argument and told her he should call his buddies to come over and kill both of them. His mother reported that she was, quote, very frightened of her son's behavior when he blows up like this, end quote. He also had a subsequent arrest in Wisconsin for burglary and fraudulent use of a credit card. He sounded like a great suspect, what with leaving the state so soon after Danny's death. But Detective Botek could not go interview him because in September of 2000, Brocklacker had been killed in a car accident in Greene County, Wisconsin. And that pretty much ended that avenue of investigation. Danny's sister Stephanie, who was only 12 when her big sister died under incomprehensible circumstances, had started investigating her sister's case herself. Now it was 2019. She had heard about Golden State Killer being apprehended all those years later and started to think about Danni and how no one ever resolved what had happened to her. She knew that modern technology might shed new light on the case that was still not classified as a murder. The family felt strongly that Danni had been killed by someone who was there that day at the fishing access. Stephanie told the Montana Free Press, quote, I always knew in my heart that it couldn't have been an accident, end quote. She talked about the trauma Danny's death inflicted on her own life. Quote, I've had a lifetime of nightmares about losing someone and how people were just going to be taken away from me, people I love. I'll wake up sobbing in the middle of the night. I've had to resolve my trauma. I've had to do therapy and figure out how to live a life and then come back and fight for her. Stephanie started calling the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and asking questions. Her phone calls were initially met with resistance, she said. But after about 6 months, Sheriff's Detective Matt Boxmeyer contacted her and said he would look into the case. He had grown up in Bozeman and recalled when Danni died. Boxmeyer had also met with Detective Cindy Botek when she was facing retirement. She wanted to ensure that Danny's case was not forgotten. Boxmeyer reviewed the case file and concluded that despite the medical examiner's wishy-washy ruling, Danny's death was no accident. Boxmeyer noted, quote, blunt force injuries on extremities, scalp on back of head, face, legs, bruises and scrapes, laceration in her genital area consistent with sexual assault. Given the footprints in the mud and the initial observations of the on-scene detectives of Danny's arm being up over her head, her watch having been pulled down under her hand, and her shirt being pushed up, Boxmeyer concluded that someone had dragged Danni to where she lay in an attempt to hide her. The detective met with Stephanie in February 2020 and told her he felt that Danni had indeed been murdered. The family had literally never heard this before from law enforcement other than Detective Botek. They had always been told that Danni had fallen and drowned. This shocking turn of events, of course, led them to press for a complete reinvestigation of the case, which the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office agreed to. Relying on the sheriff's investigators to help them for real this time required a leap of faith for the Houchinses. Stephanie reflected that the family had been burned before in placing their trust in law enforcement. She told the Montana Free Press, quote, one of the real pieces of sensitivity I had and my family had walking into the reinvestigation of Danny's case was the sheer fact that while we thought law enforcement was on our side, they lied to us in 1996 and they withheld information from us. That led to a significant feeling of distrust with the sheriff's department, end quote. But that administration was long gone. There was soon to be a new sheriff in town, literally, and Danny's case was going to get the attention it deserved. In March of 2020, Detective Boxmeyer emailed Cheryl Houchins introducing himself and told her, quote, back in 2014, I started looking at Danny's case file to familiarize myself with every aspect of the case. I talked in depth with Cindy Botek about Danni and made a promise to continue to try and get resolution for you and your family, end quote. Cheryl responded, quote, it's good to hear that Danni has not been forgotten. It's been so long and honestly feels like nobody cares. In June of 2020, Stephanie emailed the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office formally requesting that all case information be shared with the family. She wrote, quote, in the 24 years since Danny's death, very little has ever been shared about her case with her family. At some point, there was talk of some DNA evidence and Danny's case shared with us by Detective Botek, but that somehow that evidence has never been processed and or was unusable. The only other information that was shared with us is that Danny's death was considered foul play, homicide, and that she was not sexually assaulted. Is there DNA evidence? Is it usable? Was it ever processed? In these days of forensic genealogy, could that be useful? It's been 13 years since a detective last investigated Danny's case. As you can imagine, while we are thrilled that you and your team have picked her case up, that's a long time of darkness and no movement. We are willing to reopen the pain, to relive the grief, but we need a benchmark to measure our hope against. The DNA evidence is that benchmark. How hopeful should we really be 24 years later that Danny will ever receive justice?" End quote. The Sheriff's Department agreed to meet with the family on September 28, 2020, to present them with what they knew about the case, that it was a homicide and Danny had been sexually assaulted. This is from an interview Danny's sister Stephanie did on 48 Hours. Quote, "I learned that rather than drowning on just water, Danny's head had been held down in the mud. She had mud all the way down into her lungs and into her stomach. There was subcutaneous bruising on the back of her neck. Someone had held her head down forcefully. There were vaginal injuries. There was semen in her underwear. She had fought and scratched. I was so angry at the people who lied to my family and let my sister's murder go unsolved and uninvestigated for all of these years." End quote. This was literally the first the family had heard of Danny being sexually assaulted 24 years after her death. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and the family together worked with local news station KBZK on a special report on Danny's case. It aired in April 2021 and generated some tips that would be investigated and cleared. Dan Springer became Gallatin County Sheriff in 2021. He and Chief Deputy Eric Paulson fully believed that Danny had been murdered and vowed to do whatever they could to bring her case to a conclusion for the family's sake, even though the sheriff knew all too well that it would make previous work by his agency look very bad. In connection with the 25th anniversary of Danny's death in the fall of 2021, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office made a public plea for information. The agency wanted to alert the public that they were working the case and ask for any help they could get. The Sheriff's Office wrote in a Facebook post, quote, "Today marks the 25th anniversary of the still unsolved Danielle Houchins homicide. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office continues to investigate this case and follow up on leads, but we still need your help. Danny is gone, but not forgotten, and her family deserves answers. Sheriff Springer is committed to putting resources toward this investigation in order to find justice for Danny." In 2022, Sheriff Springer had realized that his agency was characterized by evident internal political divisions, territorial behavior, and lack of sophistication in investigative techniques. He decided they needed to bring in an outside perspective on Danny's case. Sheriff Springer told the Montana Free Press, quote, "People have picked it up and tried to run with it to where they could, and things have gotten cold over time. In 2019, the case was reopened by the sheriff's office, and then in 2021, I became sheriff. And I just felt we needed some fresh eyes on this. Someone with different experience, different knowledge base, and fresh eyes." Then Sheriff's Captain Eric Paulson, a former gang detective from Santa Ana, California, knew a local guy who might be able to help. Tom Elfmont was a Vietnam vet and had been a captain in the Los Angeles, California Police Department, but had retired near Bozeman and ran a security firm. Paulson and Springer met with Elfmont in March of 2023. Over lunch, they discussed what could be done to advance Danny's case. Elfmont agreed to work the case and was sworn in as a Gallatin Special Service Deputy and was provided the resources available to the sheriff's office to work the case. Elfmont dove into this new assignment with both feet. He reviewed the fairly meager case materials, interviews, reports, and supplements, and made a massive list of outstanding questions, loose ends, leads to be followed up on, and people to be tracked down. He noted that Stephen Brucklacker had never been ruled out, and confirmed a police report about Brucklacker getting beaten up on the day of Danny's murder, explaining his injuries. Elfmont started interviewing everyone he could track down. He talked to everyone in Danny's family. He interviewed Ben E., a very good friend of Danny's, who had active Facebook and Instagram pages discussing the case with people in the Belgrade community. Elfmont spoke with Sam T. and Alex H., both associates of Danny's. He interviewed Laura Henson, Ryan D., and Steve R., all of whom were close friends of Danny's. None of them had significant information to add, but they all told Elfmont that Danni was absolutely a true victim, and that those who had been interviewed by the sheriff's department back in 1996 had felt intimidated and bullied. Elfmont interviewed Randy S., the Big Sky ski patroller who had driven Rex back to Belgrade on the day Danni's body was found. He interviewed Levi, Stephanie's childhood friend. He even talked to Kim H., the mother of the deceased Stephen Brucklacker. Elfmont was shocked to learn that the original investigators had never interviewed any of the people whose license plates had placed them in the parking lot at the Cameron Bridge fishing area on the day Danni was found. He called them up, and 2 of them verified that they often fished at that location, although they could not, of course, recall whether they were there that day, and they certainly did not recall anything unusual happening. The 3rd person was openly hostile and said he didn't remember anything and hung up. Elfmont began to be interested in Adam V., who had been named a person of interest in the case by Detective Botek. He started doing some background research on him and learned that in 1996, he was 16. In 1999, the then 19-year-old racked up a theft and criminal mischief charge for stealing gas from a Thriftway gas station and causing property damage. Adam was arrested again at age 28 in 2008 and sentenced to 15 months in prison for the crime of transferring obscene materials to a minor. People reported that he had told them things like he shouldn't have done it, but it was unclear what he was talking about. Elfmont also noted retired Detective Botek's interest in Heath R., but he ruled him out after interviewing him. One angle that really intrigued Elfmont were the child molestation and grooming behaviors of former Deputy Sergeant Gary Wellsand. Remember, he was the lead investigator on Danni's case, and his crimes against prepubescent and teen girls had all come to light in 1998. Elfmont didn't so much think that Wellsand was Danni's killer, but he was so disgusted by the lenient treatment of Wellsand, he called up the original prosecutor on the case back in the late 1990s. He asked him why more serious charges and jail time were not imposed on the criminal sheriff's deputy. The prosecutor's response was, well, the girls had some issues. Elfmont's report says, I responded, 12 and 13-year-old girls sexually groomed and assaulted by a 50-year-old sheriff's detective would have issues. He said that he didn't like my tone and hung up. Elfmont ended up interviewing Gary Wellsand in person. He said he wasn't aware that Danni's case wasn't classified as a homicide, which is either a blatant lie or he has the worst memory of all time, since we know he told one of his victims that Danni had died of an accidental drowning. Elfmont also interviewed Kelly B., one of the men who had found Danni's body. He noted that he refused to provide a DNA sample or take a polygraph. Detective Elfmont talked with one of the original investigators and the first deputy on the scene, Keith Farquhar. Farquhar told him that he had been haunted by the case for the past 28 years. This is a quote from Elfmont's report. He told me that Sheriff Slaughter, 3 days after Danni's death, walked into the squad room and basically said, this case is an accidental death and that's the end of it. Captain Christie, Detective France, and Detective Farquhar all heard this comment. You might be thinking to yourself, why is Elfmont starting with all this old-school gumshoe detective stuff when no one has tested anything for DNA in years? The answer is they were working on it. Of course, Elfmont read the reports from back in 2010, when Danni's underwear were found to have a single sperm cell on the crotch. And of course, he knew that modern technology could very likely successfully obtain a DNA profile from that sample. But no one had tested the underwear since then because no one could find them. Detective Botek had noted years earlier that all the things collected from Danni's pockets, her license, pack of cigarettes, her lighter, and so on, were lost. Well, so was the pair of underwear that had a sperm cell on it when it was last tested in 2010. And remember, there were no swabs collected at her autopsy. A sexual assault kit was not done. No suspect DNA profile in Danni's case had ever been entered into CODIS. It was 2023. What a shambolic mess. Tom Elfmont told me that DNA was not his specialty. He was a gang and drug detective in Los Angeles. Knowing full well that DNA might make or break the Danni Houchins case, he decided to consult an investigator who had been through this before and is considered something of an expert. He brought in Newport, California Detective Sergeant Court Depweg as a consultant on the case and started discussing their options for DNA testing given the situation. Then, in March of 2023, Joe Pasternak of the Montana State Crime Lab told Detective Elfmont that he had located the underwear, which for 12 years had been misfiled with another case file in the long-term storage facility. They urged the crime lab to test the underwear ASAP. On July 5, 2023, Pasternak informed the investigators that he was able to develop a partial male DNA profile from Danni's underwear. Finally, at long last, a suspect profile was entered into the state and national DNA databases. Not a single hit. But confirmation that a male had left his DNA on the outside of Danni's underwear was sufficient to allow Sheriff Dan Springer to take a very important step to right a wrong, a step of deep significance to Danni's family. In August of 2023, he saw to it that the official manner of death in Danni's case was changed from undetermined to homicide. And then he approved the investigator's decision to move to an IgG analysis to identify Danni's killer, including paying all the expenses associated with private lab work and a parabon analysis. Sergeant Depweg recommended that the semen on the underwear be submitted to a private lab to obtain a SNP profile so that his genealogist of choice, C.C. Moore, with whom he had successfully closed cases in the past, could perform her IgG magic. But the whole thing came crashing down when the semen in the underwear proved not to contain sufficient DNA to obtain a SNP profile. No SNP, no IgG. What else did they have? The cigarette butts found in Danni's truck yielded no DNA profile when tested with modern DNA extraction techniques, so those were a bust. The remainder of Danni's clothes weren't available for testing either, but they had 4 hairs. This is the end of part 1 of the Danielle Houchins case. Part 2 is available right now.